The Florida Podcast Network, the voice of Florida.
From Mallory Square in Key West to the Governor's Mansion in Tallahassee and all points beyond, you're listening to the Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com, your source for all things related to the craft beer community in the Sunshine State. And now your host, Dave Butler.
Welcome to another episode of the Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com. This is Dave, your host and author. Before we get into everything, obviously make sure to follow us on social media at Florida Beer Blog on Instagram and Twitter, FL Beer Blog on Facebook, and FloridaBeerPodcast.com. Obviously, also make sure to check us out at FloridaBeerBlog.com, where we continue to post articles about some amazing beers from around the Sunshine State. If you're listening to us on a podcasting app, thank you so much. Hopefully you will like and subscribe to us on your podcasting app. And if there's a way to rate us, such as on Apple Music, please do so. It definitely helps people find the show. We are also a proud member of the Florida Podcast Network, and you can find them at FloridaPodcastNetwork.com. They've got a lot of great shows up and coming and a lot of awesome releases. So definitely make sure to check them out. We are continuing to observe the events that are going on in Southwest Florida. We have a lot of breweries that are starting to come up and running. This audio was recorded a little while ago before the release, so hopefully we will have more good news that is coming out. It looks like we also have several groups that are making beers that are raising funds specifically for Southwest Florida. If you see those coming to a brewery near you, please make sure to support and help out these absolutely amazing people and an absolutely amazing amount of work that they are going to have to go through to rebuild after the effects of Hurricane Ian. For today's interview, if you've been to Ybor City and you've been on the far west side, and we'll use Berry House as a brewery sort of marker, you will have noticed a very tall brick building with the Florida Brewery faded on the side. That is the home of Florida's original craft brewery, the Florida Brewery, and it opened its doors on February 15th, 1897. It was owned in part by Vincente Ybor himself as a way to supply beer to the workers of the cigar factories that made Ybor City so famous. It closed in the 60s, and until that time, it basically sat vacant. It is now the home of a law firm by the name of Swope Rodante. They have taken it upon themselves to not only revitalize the building, but also keep it as historically accurate as they can, while obviously maintaining their law firm. They've also made sure to be a very good friend to Tampa's craft beer industry. And we actually spoke to Dale Swope himself, half of Swope Rodante, about his background as a lawyer, obviously, his desire to build a law firm, not just in Tampa and Ybor specifically, but that building, which for many years, as you're about to hear, was basically an eyesore. Now it's a major anchor to an awesome revitalization in Ybor City. We'll talk to him about that. And obviously he'll give us a little insight into Florida's craft beer scene, especially the scene in Tampa, and what those beers meant to him. Enjoy. Before we talk about your location, before we talk about Tampa, before we talk about beer and everything, obviously I'd like to learn a little bit about you, as to how you decided to become a lawyer and create the firm that is known as Swope Rodante.
You know, that's not a great story. The truth of it is I came out of law school in 1978, and that was one of those times when the economy was kind of in a crash, basically the opposite of what we're enjoying right now. So a lot of people didn't have jobs. I was able to get one down in Palm Beach County for a great lawyer, but I think it just probably was true that I wasn't cut out to work for other people. So after about 2 months or 3 months, I quit that job returned back home to Tampa, and I have been unemployed ever since. So that's how the firm, there's a fine line between an unemployed lawyer and a self-employed lawyer. And next thing you know, I just felt like I had something to prove. And so we set out to make not just a successful firm, but what we think is, in our minds, at least the best firm in the state of Florida. So here we are.
Okay. What kind of law do you practice? Because I didn't realize that there are so many different kind of law firms out there.
Tremendous amounts. And what I what I do for a living has very little in common with what many lawyers do for a living. We have a subspecialty. It's called insurance bad faith. And insurance bad faith is if you have $100,000 of insurance in your car, for example, and you have a bad accident, and now you've caused $3 or $4 million of damages, your insurance company ought to get out and try to settle that case if they can for the $100,000. But insurance companies, being insurance companies, they're lazy and they're greedy and they're selfish, and for a variety of reasons, they frequently don't do what they're supposed to do. And so you end up now with a judgment against you for $5 million in a case that could have been settled for their $100,000. And in those circumstances, the law protects you. And the law says that firms like ours can sue your insurance company, force them to pay that judgment off, and so that you're back to where you should have been. And in the meantime, the injured person gets that $4 or $5 million and has a full recovery. So they think we're heroes. Our clients think we're heroes. Everybody loves us, except, of course, the insurance companies. And that's what we've made a living at. That, and then it was a short step until we started handling, very catastrophic injuries ourselves, not routine accidents, but people who have spinal cord or brain injuries or death or, blindness, those sort of injuries. And we had a good time with it.
All right. So you were working for a lawyer in West Palm. How did you decide to set up a practice in Tampa, in the Tampa area?
This is my home. I am, as they say, well, I won't tell you what we call ourselves here, but you can imagine I'm a native.
I think I know the name.
Yeah.
I think I know the name.
I'm a full-blooded Tampan. We'll go with that, okay? And my mother actually was born here. So my grandfather came down in World War I, and so it was home. And I grew up not too far from Ybor City. The initial office wasn't here. The initial office was traditional in downtown Tampa, in an ugly office building, and then we moved to Harbor Island in due course. But about 1990, I was itching to have my own building. And, I wanted to
ask as to why Ybor City, because you could have stayed with the traditional boring downtown office.
Yeah, well, that ain't me, man. And I looked at the other historical parts of Tampa, which are Hyde Park, and they're awfully foofy. Ybor City was attractive to me because it's a place built around people who actually work. They work with their hands, they sweat. And that's just my life, My family are roofers, and we are proud of that. And that's kind of who I wanted to be. My partner also, by then, Angela Rodante, her mom, you could think of as Mrs. Ybor. She's no longer with us, unfortunately, but she was born into a home maybe 4 blocks from where our office is now. She worked in Ybor. She was very active in the Ybor City Museum Society and the Centro Estudiano and all the other social clubs of Ybor City and institutions. And so it was just a natural fit. Now, finding the right building in Ybor was a different story altogether, because in the 1990s, Ybor was not awesome.
It was not exactly the best place to be, which is
our building,
definitely not the case anymore.
My partner in the building is my former law clerk, a guy named Joe Kokolakis, who is my best friend. And Joe is a tremendous builder. He's built airsides at Tampa International Airport, lots of intricate buildings at MacDill, renovated West Point, for example. And so Joe and I were looking together for the place, and he came up with this building. And at that point, this building, the Florida Brewing Company building, had been abandoned for 40 years. It had been abandoned since, and I say abandoned, the brewery had been closed in 1963. They were storing tobacco in a small section of it. Most of the building was unused, and there was not a window in the building. The electricity worked, but it was that kind with the exposed wires, and you just have to hold your breath if you turned a switch on. Maybe you'd get electrocuted, maybe you wouldn't.
So it was kind of like Frankenstein's laboratory.
Yeah, it was. It had a tree growing out of the side of it that had at least a 5-inch thick trunk. The tower had been burned off due to lightning strikes. It was the main stairs that took you up were rusted. They were cast iron and rusted. And part of the entire deck on the top floor was just sunk through. Homeless people had lived here for a while, but they moved out due to the conditions not meeting their standards. So,
okay, so we've got a building that's in massive disrepair that is too unsavory for homeless people.
Yeah.
What did you see when you saw this building and said, law firm?
You know, I didn't. I said, Joe, I don't think so, buddy. I love you to death, but that's just not the right one. I had seen the building. Everybody knew the building. It was at that moment the ugliest building in all of Ybor City, without a doubt. When I was a child, my dad used to go to a place called Eagle Roofing, which is 2 blocks away, and we drove past this building as a child before they closed it in 1963. And I didn't know what it was then. And all those years, I never imagined that it was a brewery. I thought it had something to do with cigars. It didn't look like the other cigar factories, but I don't think anybody understood what had ever happened here. And so Joe called me down and he said, just sit down and wait a minute. Well, he had dug up all the historical pictures of this building and what it was like from its original inception, and all the history that was behind it, and my jaw dropped. And I went from being, there's no possible way, to being, whatever we have to do, we have to make this work. And so
I would love to know, what did you have to do to make this work? That sounds like it's going to be a massive undertaking.
It was, look, I wouldn't have done it without Joe. My builder as my partner made it possible. Otherwise, I would just be bankrupt today. But with him as my partner, I knew that we were spending everything we had to spend, but not a penny more. And that made it to where, you know, my only job here was to criticize everything and help come up with the money. And Joe did the hard part. But we sat with our architects, and we, you know, the brief from the beginning was, we're not going to change anything that we don't have to change. Look, the brewery is an industrial building, right? It is made for people to work. It had a run of about 85 years. During that 85 years, they tore things down. They built additions. They added warehouses on and another warehouse on. They got rid of the stables that originally had housed their fleet of horses. They went from producing their own electricity with a smokestack and burning coal to create electricity, and having overhead power transmission through leather belts. They went from that to having Tampa Electric electricity, and they went to having, you know, all those changes over 80 years that occurred during that time had left the building in, as you would any industrial building. There was no as-built plans. We didn't have any idea where things were. And we just said, this is going to be the passion and the work of our lifetime. And it took 2.5 years. It took about, what we paid for the building represented about 8% of the overall cost. So fortunately, we had some wonderful banking arrangements at the time, and those guys made it possible for us to be able to do that.
Since you had to go to banks to get funding, since you had to go to community, you had to go to the city to submit plans, and you had to talk to all these firms to do construction. When they found out what you were doing in the building that you were doing it in, what was the community reaction?
You know, Joe Capitano, who's one of the great founders of the Renaissance of Ybor City, said, Dale, I have looked at that building and you're an idiot. My dad, who is a lifetime construction guy, said, Dale, I don't know how to talk you out of it because I've never won an argument with you, but I got to win this one. You can't do this. It's going to bankrupt you. And it damn near did. I mean, you know, I came into this with a solid savings account. And I came out of it like the guy who was shipwrecked and washed up on the beach and finally found ground under his feet. I'll tell you how this was. And the part of the pressure was that everything, of course, runs overdue. We're demolishing and planning without, like, we're moving forward before the plans are built because time is the enemy. From a financial standpoint, you got to get this done. And I'm paying double rent at Harbor Island because my lease has expired. And they're giving me no slack because they know I'm leaving them. And so they're charging me double. We moved in while construction was still going on. We're practicing law while construction's going on. I have announced a big party that's going to occur in December of that year, a massive party, invited hundreds of people to it, and everybody wants to come see it. We weren't finished. We literally had guests coming in the ground floor, and I was up on the top floor working with electricians to finish the wiring to make the lights work on the top floor deck so that by the time they got up there, we would have a finished product for them. I told my partner, keep them down there, entertain. I don't care what you have to do. Don't let them up yet. So it was a series of crises, so everything worked out wonderfully in the end.
And obviously, now that you have this gorgeous building, and I cannot wait to go into the history of it with you, obviously, now it seems to be an anchor of that side of Ybor City and kind of what's the revitalization that's there, because you've got other breweries. I know you're very close to Berry House.
Love Berry House.
So do I. Great people. The trolley goes right by there. You've got hotels and apartment complexes that are coming up. I am sure that you have had offers. I'm sure that you have had people come over to kick the tires and turn it into lofts or an event space or something. Do you think you can ever see yourself leaving?
No, I don't imagine that I would ever be any place but here. We're enjoying right now the attention of a developer named Daryl Shaw, who is, at first you're suspicious of him because it seems like nobody can be such a good guy as he is, but he is. And he is making this massive gasworks project down in this corner of Ybor City. And it is going to transform everything. It's going to make, I think, it's going to leave our brewery as kind of the corner of Ybor City, which is what it is now. But it is the first thing you see when you come from downtown to Ybor City. The first place you pass is our brewery, which is the tallest building in Ybor by law. And so it's just everything is going our way on that. Don't ask me to leave.
I didn't realize
I can't imagine where I would go.
I didn't realize that yours is the tallest building by law. I guess, when did that pass? Does that harken back to Ybor's days as a cigar rolling center with Mr. Ybor himself, or is that relatively recent?
Well, no, that law was passed whenever they got it was an ordinance that happened about the time that Ybor got to be the certification as a National Historic District. They said, we'll protect that building. This building was the tallest building in Florida when it was built in 1896, it's only 6 stories tall. So that's a little bit embarrassing for Florida, right? Yeah. That's who we were. We were mostly an agricultural place at that time. So it was the tallest building then. And by, like I say, by ordinance, it is still the tallest building in Ybor City. So
that's amazing.
And it was built by Mr. Ybor, Ybor and his partner Manrera. This was the only asset that he owned at his death that was not directly tied to the cigar industry.
Yeah, let's definitely go into that, because obviously we're in the late 1800s. Ybor City has been built basically to be a cigar rolling capital, to take some of the industry away from other places like Havana, like Key West. Mm-hmm. Who built it? How was a brewery decided?
It goes like this, as best I can piece it together. Okay. I mean, Cuba is about to enjoy the revolution. The Cubans have attempted once to overthrow the Spaniards, and unsuccessfully, but they never gave up. And by 1880s, the idea of a colony is kind of outmoded, right? It's been 100 years since the United States Revolution. And so the Cubans clearly wanted the Spanish out. The Americans wanted the Spanish out. And any intelligent Spaniard could see the handwriting on the wall. Mr. Ybor and some of these other guys who had like age of exploration level money, they needed to get out of Havana and move their industries north. They also wanted to get inside the territory so they could avoid a big import tariff that had come since the Civil War. So he initially went to Key West, didn't work that well because the Cubans were coming back and forth. And the dream was, let's go inside the United States, let's pick a secure place. We can bring Cuban-raised agricultural products without paying the tariff, and then we'll get some good Cubans to come up here and work and do our cigars, the kind that won't go on strike every other week. That was the dream. You hear about this place, he comes up here, he kind of decides maybe the city does something very progressive. The city fathers say, we'll give you that 40 acres that you looked at. How about that? He says, I'll take the deal. So he comes here and he builds the entire infrastructure necessary for him and all of his buddies to move from Havana and move their entire industrial operation here. At one point, Ybor City in West Tampa had 90% of the industrial output of the entire state of Florida. And this is, it's overnight, huge boom town. Well, everything is going swell, except Mr. Ybor's daughter marries a German. And I imagine the conversation goes like this. He goes, Dad, I love everything you're doing, but as you know, I don't know anything about cigars because I am, of course, German. And Mr. Ybor says, well, that's good, but you're not going to sit around the damn house all day doing nothing. What can you do? And he goes, I can't do anything. I'm a brewer. And as you know, you can't make beer in the tropics because you have to have refrigeration to Pilsner it, as we Germans do. And so Mr. Ybor's partner, Manrera, gets on the internet and he starts digging around and he finds out that in South Africa, an architectural firm has just designed the first ever brewery with artificial refrigeration on an industrial scale. And Ybor says, get that guy over here.
I find it interesting they had internet back then.
Well, it's my story. I tell it like I want. So, however it happened, they end up getting that very architectural firm. They had built one in Havana, and then the third brewery in the world to use this artificial refrigeration method, this vacuum method, is this brewery. And so on that basis, he invested all of his money. When you look at the investment records at the time, it was Ybor and Manrera, and they're kicking in $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, and the son-in-law kicked in like $415.33, right? That's how much he had. But he was the brewmaster, and off they were going. Now, I'll tell you one more thing. Ybor City, Tampa, is wonderful in the sense that every major city on the East Coast has an immigration story. Philadelphia has their Italians, Boston has the Irish people, and so on. New York has different mixtures. What makes Tampa different is Tampa had disappeared by 1888. Tampa had become 800 people. The Fort Brooke, which was the economic center of Tampa, closed at the Civil War. There was nothing left. The First National Bank had literally voted to close up. And so you have this tremendous story of Ybor bringing the Spaniards bringing their money, the Cuban artisans coming with to roll cigars, a third immigrant group, or the Italians, who ended up here by an interesting story that I won't go into, but the Italians move over and empty basically the entire island of Sicily, or at least the Magazzola Valley comes here. But there's a fourth immigrant group that nobody ever pays attention to, which are the Eastern European and German Jews. And those came here for the brewery. We still have the remnants. We have the German American Club. And anybody who rides down 7th Avenue in Ybor City will notice that the buildings all have German and Jewish names built into the buildings, because those were the merchant class who came here as a result of this brewery. So that's a pretty good story.
That's really interesting. I did not know that.
And I'll give you one more before we move off of history, a pretty good story on this too. So in 1896, the brewery is opened up. By 1903, it's in full swing. And back then, breweries would typically own bars that they would sell there. It was called a tied house. It's kind of illegal now, but that's how you distributed your beer back then, is you owned a series of bars and they got done. The brewmaster at the time had a bar down at the other end of Ybor City, and they were selling beer in their bars, selling La Tropical to the cigar workers.
Uh-huh.
Well, a fella comes over from Cuba named Casimiro Hernandez, and he goes to work in the brewery, and it must have been a pretty good guy, because pretty soon the brewmaster says, Casimiro, would you mind going down and managing my place down there? Nobody we have speaks Spanish, and these are all Spanish cigar workers. How about you do it? And he says, that'd be great. That'd be 1903. And he is managing this bar down there, which by 1905, they decided that he would buy it. And so Casimiro Hernandez became the owner in 1905 of the Columbia Cafe. And that, of course, is now the Columbia Restaurant. And Casimiro Hernandez's descendants are the Gonzamart family, who are one of Tampa's great families, who are spread everywhere and done good everywhere they go. But one of the interesting things is one of the assets that the Gonzamart families have built is the Ulele restaurant down at the river. Well, our brewery is where it is because there's an underground river here, and it comes up into what was known as the Government Spring, which is located right here. And the Government Spring, if you continue that underground aquifer, it ends up at the Hillsborough River at Ulele, and they call it the Ulele Springs. Well, of course, they have a brewery at Ulele. So what that means is that the great descendants of Casimiro Hernandez are now brewing beer using the same water source that he brewed beer at when he first came to work at the Florida Brewing Company building.
That's
pretty
amazing.
Fun. Yeah, I like that.
That is
story.
amazing. So you've got this incredible building that has a lot of history. When you went through the renovation process, when you decided that this is going to be your home and you're going to sink as much money as you could into it, you have kept as much of the history of the building as you could. To this day, on the side of the building, there's a large artwork mural of the Florida Brewery. It's a little faded, but you can see it when you enter the main facility. Obviously, it's got the name of the Florida Brewery. That has been restored or rebuilt. How much did you want to keep its former history alive in what you were doing?
100%. You have to respect the amount of work that men and women have done here over the years. And I'm not just going to tear that down or try to forget it, right? We're just not doing that. Now, look, you had to make some modifications because law firms need quiet and we need some privacy, but we compromised. The brief to Joe was, do not change anything we don't need to change. And they took that literally. We have nails that are still coming out of walls. We have pipes that stick out. We have pipes that go through walls. The floors are still the same concrete. We didn't finish the bricks in any way or try to cover them in any way. The stairs were made safe. We kept the old historic stairs, which had the handrails are about thigh height, just enough to you flip over onto your head when you fall. So we put safety glass up on the inside of them to make them safe. But in every respect, we even fought against, there's a regulation that say you can't have the communication of air more than 2 floors. In other words, you have to have a fire door if you have more than 2 floors that connect. And in our building, the skylights up on the very top provide filtered light that goes all the way down to the ground floor. And I just wasn't going to do that. So we worked with some guys and figured out a system called the water curtain system that means that you can keep the entire building open the way that it was originally designed to be done. Anywhere where we changed it, we have marked that with a code. We've got red steel headers anywhere that we made an opening. And other than that, it's identically the same. One of the funnest things about the building is that you can go through and look in the mortar and in the bricks, and you can see twigs or cigarette butts from the workmen who built this building. And they left it there, right? And it's been there for over 100 years. And we damn sure ain't going to tear that down, right?
And I was
No way.
going to ask, like, when you went through, are there any artifacts from its brewing days that you were able to save and salvage and sort of display?
Yeah, there were miscellaneous things. There's, of course, the original elevator was still here. There were big devices that were used at the base of the, I haven't fully 100% put together how the processing of the beer occurred here, but I know that there were what I would call agitation tanks towards the top sections of this where the fermentation occurred. And they had big, heavy cast iron pieces there. There were innumerable bottles that we found during the process. There's bottles all over. We owned a house 5 blocks away from here, and in the construction of that house, we found a tropical beer bottle buried down in it. And it's one of the early ones from the 1890s,
Oh, wow.
So, and right after they built the brewery, they got the brewery finished. And now somebody says, wait, you guys, we have water and we have refrigeration. Hell, we could make ice. And they were like, yeah, let's make ice. So they added an ice house. The Ybor City Ice Works is adjacent, and it looks like part of our building now. And so the government spring is actually down inside of that. The spring, you can't know where it is if you don't know where it is, but because it's under the ground. And the tunnels that supplied our beer out to all the speakeasies in Ybor City, if you don't know where those are, you can't see them, but they're preserved, So, as a matter of fact, the government spring, the cap on the spring that was put there when they first started brewing beer, rusted out about 10 years ago. And our tenants over there started the floor would get wet at high tide, and nobody could figure out what was going on. We thought we had a plumbing pipe broken or who knows what. And we tore all down in there and dug it out, and it was the spring. It was coming back, man. So
that's amazing. And what I find interesting is in this complete and total history coming around full circle, in a few weeks, you are actually going to be hosting the Tampa release of La Tropicale, which obviously they've been on the podcast before, based in Wynwood, kind of based on the original brewery and the recipe that was in Havana all those years ago. Is it kind of this a wonderful kismet for you to be a part of that brand sort of being reintroduced to Tampa?
Yeah. It's awesome. I mean, I knew Manny before he ever began this. We met him. My nephew played soccer with, I think, his son, and we just coincidentally ran into him. It is interesting. There are some historians who say that our beer was the same beer as their beer. And there are some historians who have the impression that they had common ownership. And I do not believe that that's accurate. I believe that the brewery in Havana, which, now there's Cristal that's just coming out of that brewery, I believe that was a totally different brand, although they had the same name. Their label was one that prominently displayed 5 gold medals and still does. That's the label that Manny is using, is the label that beer has always used. The label for this beer, this La Tropicale, is much simpler and designed. The taglines were taste tells. That was everywhere. It had a big barrel with alligators on it, which is part of the city's seal now. They incorporate some of that. And the other tagline was an ale for males, which I love. So I don't know that they're the same beer, but, it's close enough to where we should celebrate it. And I'm thrilled that they want to do their kickoff here.
That's amazing. And like I said, it's great to finally be able to chat with you and learn a little bit about the history of the building, which is such an anchor for Ybor and for Florida's craft beer community. And hopefully I will be able to come down to Ybor City one time and get a tour directly from you.
100%. And one thing I want to say is that the Tampa craft beer community is like nothing else I have ever seen. These guys, not only is it an impeccably wonderful product. But the way that they work together and support each other is a model for how industry ought to work, instead of everybody trying to cut each other's throat and pull the rug out from under them. These guys work together to make everybody. They're floating all the boats with this high tide. So come on down. You'll love it.
That is amazing. We'll grab a beer at a Berry House.
We'll grab an Iceworks beer, which has got a picture of the Ybor City Iceworks on it. So,
oh wow,
yeah, it's great beer.
That's awesome. There's so much to learn. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it, and I will hopefully talk to you soon.
Okay, Dave. Thanks for having me on the show.
And there you have it. What comes around goes around. Years, actually decades after La Tropicale was brewed in Tampa, it will be coming back later this month. Pekala, the Ybor lager, the traditional recipe is a Vienna lager. It's one of my absolute favorite beers on the planet. I could probably drink it. Well, I'm not going to drink a ton of beer. I mean, I got to drink other things too. But it is a fantastic beer. And to finally see it returning to Tampa all those decades later is absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for Dale Swope for your time and giving us a little bit of insight into the history of Tampa and Ybor craft beer. Next week, we are not going to be in the state of Florida. We're actually heading north to North Carolina, and we're going to talk about the kind of unsung ingredient in beer, because obviously the water is important and everybody loves to talk about the hops and all the adjuncts, and maybe some people talk about the yeast, but not a whole lot of people talk about malt. So we're going to be on a malt heavy episode next week. Make sure to follow us on social media and like and subscribe on your favorite podcasting app of choice, and you'll be notified when that episode comes out. In the meantime, thank you so much for listening. Florida Beer Podcast is a proud member of the Florida Podcast Network. Jeff Brozovich is our intro announcer. Field producer is Steve Pekala. Executive producer for the Florida Podcast Network and Grand High Poobah is Jemmy Legagneur. This is Dave, your host and author, signing off. Thank you so much. We will be back next week for some awesome Florida craft beer related discussions. In the meantime, regardless of how old that beer is, drink Florida craft.